is Caroline Allen, who's co-coordinator of the London Green Party, but also a vet, so nobody can say she doesn't know what she's talking about. So, right, Caroline.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming along this evening. So I'm here to talk about a subject that's very close to my heart. I am a vet, I would class myself as a scientist and a clinician, and I'm also passionately green and passionately against animal testing and animal experimentation. And that's a journey that I've actually taken from someone who experimented on animals and believed that they were absolutely necessary for scientific progress, through to actually feeling quite differently. Now, the Green Party policy is a long-standing ethical position. I'm not claiming that, that we're ahead of the science or anything like that. It is an ethical position that we believe fits with our other policies around things such as the ending factory farming, ending of fur, banning fur imports. We do not believe that animals should be used and should be kept in cages and submitted to painful procedures solely for the benefit of human advancement. And that's a long-standing position. We have a very strong position in support of what some people call the alternatives. Now I'm going to explain why I actually think they're the betters, but they are called the alternatives. And we think it's very important that all the results get published, because there's a big problem that a lot of results of actually any science, but particularly the science involving animals, isn't actually published, so that we get a lot of repetition, a lot of unnecessary testing, and that's something that we're very clear about. So that's our position, but the question that I'm really here to sort of pose today is, does that make us anti-science? Because it's certainly something that we do come across as a sort of quite regular criticism, actually. The Greens are anti-science. Now, if I may, I'm just going to take a slight aside just to talk a little bit about Greens and science. I was involved in rewriting our science policy about 4 or 5 years ago, and so I'm quite keen to push that out there, because there is still a bit of misunderstanding. We are a very pro-science party, I believe. We have some very strong policy about the importance of funding for science, and the importance of funding basic research, and ensuring that there is funding that is not just coming from certain corporations. We do support funding from government as being very important. We also say that funding streams need to be long-term. That's something that's very important, and separate from very big projects such as CERN and things like that, which can suck money for more basic research. We also talk specifically about the importance of academic freedom, about government not being able to meddle. You may remember the government meddling in bodies that have been doing research on sort of drug misuse, for example, trying to stop them publishing. And also where libel laws have been used to stop scientists really putting out their opinion based on their research. And we've got very specific policy to stop those kind of things from happening. I've talked a bit about transparency, the importance that we do publish all research, particularly research that is carried out with government funding. We really believe that there shouldn't be any secrecy, and we support a lot of the open access projects. So we think we've got very pro-science policy, and actually also our health policy we will fund things with an evidence basis. So actually we're the only party who says that. So if you hear people saying, Greens anti-science, they want everyone to have homeopathy, but actually we're the only party that actually rules that out on the national health. So that's something that's quite interesting as well. So I'm specifically talking about animal testing tonight, just because we don't have a lot of time, and there is a difference between animal testing and animal experimentation. I'm going to talk about animal testing because it's quite a good way to just explain the sort of background to this argument. It's where there's a lot of research going on at the moment that really, I think, explains the scientific problems with animal experimentation more widely. But animal testing specifically is when animals are used for toxicity testing of potential drugs. It's a subset of animal experimentation. Animal experimentation involves much more. Besides, it involves the use of animal models for more fundamental research. It involves just the use of animals to find out things about those animals. So I'm just specifically talking about animal testing. I'm happy to take questions about animal experimentation, but maybe that's a presentation for another day. You know, there's a whole summer school on it that I'm hoping to go to, so it's a big area. Let's talk about a couple of concepts. They're scientific concepts, and you know, if a scientist is, might be a bit beyond my. Well, just listen. You can just say it. Do you know how to do that? No.
Anybody can make it smaller?
It's on a projector. It's focus.
I'm just not very. No, you just have to listen to me, I'm afraid.
No, don't worry.
I better not touch it, it will just walk out. So, as a scientist, you know, if you're going to make claims for something that is really important, and this is such an important test and we must do it, you have to be able to make that stand up scientifically. And there's a couple of things that we need to do in order to say that. And one of those is that we have to be able to prove causation. We have to be able to prove that something causes something else, and we can only do that by carrying out studies, research, experiments. We can't just say, well, we do this and this happens, therefore it's cause. That's correlation. It's not causation. But if we look at some of the really key arguments that the pro-animal experimentation people put forward, so this is from a site called Understanding Animal Research. I've debated this organisation. They are the biggest kind of pro-animal testing experimentation organisation. What they say, animal research has played a vital part in nearly every medical breakthrough over the last decade. That's one of their key arguments for. Nearly every Nobel laureate in physiology or medicine since 1901 has relied on animal data for their research. Number three is something you hear all the time. We have been able to develop X life-saving drug because of animal testing. Now, I'm not saying that those things are untrue. They're obviously true. We use animals all the time. So, of course, we're using millions of animals in this research. They have to, in many cases, because of regulatory regimes. But is that correlation or is it causation? Are these scientific facts or are they anecdotes? And I'm going to argue with the research that we are now seeing that these are actually anecdotes and it's actually more about correlation than causation. I'm just going to give a silly little example. I don't have any of the scientists, so sorry if I'm just insulting your intelligence a little bit here. But, I'm a vet, I do surgery every day, I do operations. So, for example, someone comes along and they audit my surgery and a neighbour's surgery, and they find that my surgical outcome is better than someone else's. And there's going to be a number of different factors that go into my operation during the day. So you will examine the health of the animal in the morning. Then I'm going to have my bowl of porridge. Then I'm going to follow my anaesthetic protocol. I'm going to have my trained veterinary nurse. I'm going to experience surgeon, and we've got hygiene protocols in place. Now, they could come and they could say, your research is so good. And I could say, well, it's so important to me that I have my bowl of porridge in the morning. That's what keeps me going. It keeps my concentration up. This is the key factor in the success of my surgery. I have that bowl of porridge before I do all my surgery. That is correlation. It correlates with a successful surgical outcome. But is it the causative factor? I do it every time. I think it is. My porridge keeps me going. But is it the causative factor? You can't actually tell me that. I could really believe that this porridge is so important to me. But what you need to do in order to identify if it's a causal factor is you need to do experiments. You need to give me Weetabix instead of porridge. Or, you need to change some other part of the protocol. It's a stupid example, but I hope it just sort of illustrates it a little bit. So, and a final, just a little scientific point that I think is worth talking about is when we look at tests, how do we decide whether they're good tests? So I have vets come into the practice quite often, and they're saying, you know, we've got this brilliant new test that you can just do by the side. You just need a drop of blood and you drop it on, and it will test if the cat in front of you has FIV, cat AIDS virus. You know, it's this brilliant new test. It's going to, you know, it's cheaper. It will save you money. It will make you money. This is the way forward. Now, for any of those tests, I don't just take the word of the vet because he's in a swish suit. He brings donuts and chocolate, which they'll do. They think that will persuade us somehow. I just don't take their word for it. I want to see figures. I want to see figures, something called the sensitivity, which is if that test tests positive for that cat, how sure am I that is a true positive? And something called specificity, which is if that test tests negative, how sure am I that that cat actually could just have it and carry on going around spreading it, but I feel happy, oh, you know, I've tested it, it's fine. And these figures are, you know, required, really, for any sensible test that we would even consider just in little North London vet practice. And the sort of figures that we would really be looking for would be 95, 97, 98%, before I would even consider, you know, using this. So if we are now talking about animal testing, something that people will tell you, this is so vitally important. Well, we've been doing it for 40 or 50 years. You know, we can't have drugs without this testing. I find myself asking, well, where are your sensitivity and specificity figures? Actually, and where is your evidence of causation? And actually, when you start looking, it's actually really shocking. Because previously they haven't been there, but what we're finding from the research that I'm going to talk about briefly is, well, they are there, but they really don't hold up in a scientific way. One example I want to talk about is something called the single-dose acute toxicity test. This, for decades, was considered absolutely crucial in testing drugs in the human market. It was the only test where the endpoint was the death of the animal, so the drug was given to a dose that it killed the animal, and you were generally looking at using 100 rodents per drug. So this is quite expensive to do. It's killing, you know, 100 animals per drug. And, you know, this was something that the lab were just doing. Until 2009, where an organisation that is involved in trying to reduce the number of experiments actually worked with AstraZeneca and 17 other companies and made them pull their data together. And this is from that website. It's not a campaigning organisation, it's not an anti-animal testing organisation, but it says, the requirement for conventional single-dose acute toxicity testing was removed from international pharmaceutical guidelines in 2009. The regulatory change was in response to a data sharing initiative. By sharing and analysing data from the companies, they demonstrated that the single-dose acute toxicity test had little scientific value in terms of identifying major organ toxicities and setting dose levels for subsequent studies. They'd been using this test for decades. It didn't add anything to it. And, you know, it's only once we started asking these questions that we found out that these, like, millions of animals were dying for nothing. Were dying so we could tick a box. You know, that is the reality. This is not a campaign group that's saying this. But shockingly, some of these companies are still doing this test. I was at a lecture with Frame, who are the Fund for Replacement of Animals in Medical Experiments. Certainly not radical, I don't think radical enough, but I was at a lecture speaking with someone from GlaxoSmithKline. They put up a slide regarding this test, but showing that some labs are still doing it. And in 2013, clinical trial applications for drugs going to humans, still 16% of them cited this test, results from this test in their data. Now, some of that may be that it was a long time ago, before 2009, but actually some of these labs are still doing it. So I would say that, you know, we absolutely have clear evidence this particular test is being done through habit. It is habit, it is, you know, unfortunately, it is just, well, this is the way that we've always done it. Of course we need to do it. Even scientists fall into that trap, vets fall into that trap, you know, we're all human. But that's just one particular test. And what I want to talk about, and I mean, I have some information sheets here, is a really groundbreaking study that has come out, well, this year. It was funded initially by the Kennel Club and by the BUAV. A scientist called Jared Bailey, trying to persuade him to come to Green Party conference, did a large study, not of all the data he wanted, because you can't get all the data from all the drug companies, but he did a large-scale study looking at, well, in total 3,200 experiments, where he looked at what had happened in the animals and then what had happened when it went to human trials. And he got basically the closest figure that you can get for sensitivity and specificity for these tests. Now he found that he found the sensitivity, when you got a positive toxic reaction in animals, you did tend to get some sort of toxic reaction in people. And, you know, but that was quite different. It didn't really help elucidate the mechanisms of that toxicity. But when we think about where is animal testing really important, the important thing is the specificity. We want to know that a true negative in an animal is going to lead to a negative in a person. They actually called that the negative predictive ratio, but it's very similar to specificity. Because if you are using an animal to say the drug is not toxic here, hence it's not going to be toxic in people, we can take that on, we can do, you know, human trials. That's really the point of what we're doing with these tests. He found that the specificity, although it was a slightly different measure he used, was so poor that this testing was virtually no better than flipping a coin. You know, and this is published, and, you know, I have yet to see anyone really convincingly sort of, you know, pull this research apart and really suggest it isn't true. So what this research is really showing is that, you know, all these animals that have been used throughout the years, you know, and not just dogs. He started with dogs, I think probably because it was, you know, easier to get funding. People get a little bit more upset about dogs, beagles in labs. He started with dogs, but subsequently went on to look at rats, mice, and rabbits. And, you know, the outcome, the quote is, the absence of toxicity in animals provides essentially no insight into the likelihood of toxicity in humans. So, you know, work needs to be ongoing, obviously, but I think that, you know, the work that I'm seeing, the people I know involved in this area, you know, the gold standard that is held up to us, the gold standard, we must use animals to make these drugs safe. There is no scientific truth to that I have seen, and increasingly, really, you know, that's being shown through science. So, what are we going to do? Well, the Safer Medicines Trust had a very interesting proposition, which was taken forward with an early day motion and a private members bill, which of course the wonderful Caroline Lucas, Green MP, supported. Unfortunately, it didn't get enough support to move forward, but it is something that we really should keep pushing for. And that is actually a large-scale comparison between animal experiments, and we wouldn't have to redo them, we have that data, and actually taking that and looking at the new panels of tests that are available. And this is something that, as Greens, you know, we really support. There are, you know, the technology is really exciting. We've seen that really, you know, legislation, changes in regulations, it drives change. There is now a complete ban on animal testing for cosmetics across Europe, including import of cosmetics. Now, I remember many years ago the pictures of the rabbits, having cosmetics put in their eye. We have to test on animals, otherwise we'll all be suffering terrible skin reactions. Well, funnily enough, that didn't happen. They managed to develop alternatives. They developed different sort of alternative skin, and we've actually found much better ways of doing it. And this is happening on animal testing. It needs to be driven much faster. Pressure needs to be put on the regulators to really realise that that gold standard is not a gold standard at all. And certainly a lot of these arguments can be applied on animal experimentation as well. It's much more difficult to do that. So hopefully I've just given you a taster of what I find really interesting, fascinating area. I've got the information from the BUAV on their different reports, and also the BUAV are going to be calling for all political parties to stand up to support their manifesto during the general election. We're already signed up. We're really happy to do that, but do have a read about the things that they're pushing for. Also, if I sort of piqued your interest, if you're interested in this in more detail, there are some really good books. Ray Greek is someone who's very interesting to read on the kind of further experimentation side of things. I did have a short film on the alternatives, and one of the really great sort of technological advances, but I can see I'm over time, so I won't show that, but if anyone wants to see it afterwards, I'd be really happy to show you. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Caroline. And by the way, on the 7th of December, you've got Christmas Without Cruelty Fair, which I hope you're all come for, a brilliant fair. We have a stall there. Caroline Lucas is there's so many Carolines, he said. Caroline Lucas is the main speaker, and also Peter Tatchell of the Great Party is speaking there. So it's worth going on that one at Kensington Town Hall all day that day. Now, just before we get to our final speaker, we have something very important, and that's the bucket. As you know, this is free, but there will be some drinking things after it. So I'd love a silent collection if possible, but if you haven't got money, don't be worried about it. I was going to say take money out, but I can't say that anymore. We need it. We need a lot of money for these elections coming up. And in the bucket, if you want to take them as well, is our new leaflets, membership leaflets. So if you befriend or someone that might want it, it's always wise to have one of these in your pocket if you're a Green Party member, because people often say